Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You can hear me?
Yes, I can.
You've been writing anything lately? You had any good writing experiences? Any good stuff you knocked out?
Well, I haven't. Not. I've been working on something but it's database related, and I'm using SQL. Do you know SQL?
I don't, but Paul is learning SQL. Paul
Well,
Robbins doing something in SQL. I thought you'd appreciate that since,
You got a big database you're dealing with, Robin?
I am. I realized I had MySQL on my laptop, and so I started doing a home inventory, and so I'm putting it all in the computer, so I can print out a nice little book about where everything is, hoping that it won't get out of date too quickly.
that sounds fun. Well, we're going to go ahead and we'll dive into this PowerPoint in this discussion. I actually had a question came to me from one of the people who follows us online, and she had a question about something she's working on with her writing and what she struggles with. And I figured we could all together talk about it and answer it. She actually emailed me today and wanted to make sure my recording was going to work this time because she wanted to make sure she could watch it and get the answer to her question. So I told her I would work on the recording. So I actually hardwired myself with a cable to try to make sure I didn't have any problems today. So hopefully that'll work. That's why I'm in a different room. So anyway, I'm gonna share this screen real quick and put this up. So her question had to do with the starting. When she's writing a story, she doesn't know how to start. How does she lead into her information when she's writing her story from her personal history? That was her question. She said she started a number of stories, but she can't figure out what to do to start the story. Not how to get started, but actually how to start the text of the story. So,
There's a joke about that.
okay, go ahead. We want jokes.
The night was dark and stormy. and so I was thinking about that as a lead-in writer, and I can actually come up with a story that works with.
There you go.
But most stories don't start with a dark and stormy night.
You're right, they don't. So here's the question. Here's her question. The main problem I am having is just how should I begin this story? I've begun many stories, but I still have trouble beginning. And so we're going to try to answer that for ourselves and for anyone who's going to watch this later. And this is one thing I point out to everyone when I talk to them. One thing you need to remember is that the story you're writing is your story, so write it your way. So any advice you can get from me, or if someone else thinks the story was different than what you're telling, your wife remembers it differently. Most importantly, if your kids remember it differently, they're wrong and you're right, it's your story. So write it your way. So when it comes even to the beginning of the story, I throw that reminder out there again, write it your way. So here's some things I just jotted down. Some questions to ponder about beginning your story. How do I draw my audience in? I'm guessing that's one of the big things we're worried about, right? Is how do I get my audience, whoever that is I'm writing for, to want to read on? So do I need a dramatic intro? Dark and stormy night? Here's a question. Do I use an inverted pyramid? Inverted pyramid, you know what that is, an inverted pyramid? That's the journalistic. That's the journalistic style of writing. You put the most important details at the top, and then you filter down to the least important details. That's an inverted pyramid of writing. That's one way to write. I don't think it works for personal histories, but do I need to have that important detail right up top? That's kind of the question. Do I need some kind of a thesis statement that I'm then going to, I would say defend, but that's not the word here. I'm going to write about and base everything around. Does that need to be stated up front? Is it better to write the story first and then revisit the opening? And how does the message I'm looking to share with my story fit into the way I begin the story? So the message I'm looking to deliver at the end, how does that impact how I begin the story, or does it? So I'm going to throw any of those out there. Any thoughts on any of that about as you think about how to begin a story?
Well, the thing I think isn't even on your list, and that is that first thing I feel like I need to do is set the period and location. I guess I write stories sequentially. You read the first one, that's the earliest one, and then it goes later. But still, you know, the world was different when I was a kid than it is today. It's going to be much, I mean, in retrospect, as my grandkids read this, my story is set in a different time than they're going to be in. And it seems to me that I need to have some kind of a preamble that sets up a when and where, that gives the story some kind of an anchor that they can hook to.
Okay. Paula, what about you? What do you think?
So I was just thinking it was a dark and stormy night. And, and at my house 20 years ago, right? Something like that.
Well, it was a dark and stormy night, and my parents took us on a drive, and they stopped at a bar on Kiski Lane in
There you
Reno,
go.
about 2 miles away from our home. And it was a real stormy night. And us kids were in the back of the car, and lightning was flashing everywhere. And instead of being afraid, we were looking at the beauty of all this lightning going all over. That's the story. I'm sure I could put some more exciting things about it.
Well,
But that kind of, that doesn't give a when, but that gives a, well, I was a young man, you know, 8.
I love that.
so when you're writing, how often do you go back and revisit your opening after you've written your story and maybe change it? Or do you just leave it? That was what it was, and that's going to stay.
The only reason I go back and revisit is if I think of something that I left out, or if I want to make sure I have proper English and spelled the things right, and didn't put an M instead of an N on the end of them or that, you know, some stupid thing. I leave a word out. That's the only reason I go back. Unless, of course, I'm trying to make an audio of that story. Then I read it again and saying it out loud. And then I find all kinds of errors.
We all do. Paul, what about you? Do you revisit when you're writing? Do you revisit your intro, your open as you finish, or?
Yes, but I think, and I struggle to do this, but just start writing something, and then revisit. Right. So what I start starting with isn't always what I end up starting with.
So does my message need to be represented in my intro, or am I looking for something dramatic and maybe it includes a message or not?
Oh, maybe it does, but a lot of times I'll start writing something and then it'll go, the story will unfold a little bit differently than I intended when I started. And then I'll go back and change the way I started so that it fits better with the story.
Okay. I am the same. I go back and revisit and usually change my opening. I'm probably looking for the dark and stormy night opening probably far too often when I'm writing for this type of writing, because I'm looking for that dramatic intro that's going to draw people in and make them want to read. And probably I go overboard in doing. I actually am going to share a couple of examples of things I've written for Rememberize. One of them is a personal story, and one of them one I wrote for somebody else. And I'll share those and I'll read them. I'll show it to you, and you can grade me and judge me. It's probably horrible, but anyway, I go back and forth. So as I do this, I want to kind of visit story development in general as part of this discussion, and then go back and talk about the intro. So every story has certain elements, and people call them different things, and in different kind of writing, they're different things. I want to talk about them, and we can discuss how these fit in your story writing. So with every story, there's a plot or a storyline. You know, the what, the why, the what if, the what happens, all that stuff is part of a storyline, a plot. And which includes a main character, a protagonist. If I'm writing about myself, it's me. I'm the protagonist. If I'm writing about someone else, it's them. Maybe it's a group of people. A situation that requires a resolution, a problem, something to be solved, something that needs to happen. The details that add color and build towards a climax, whatever those happen to be for that particular story. Why was the night dark and stormy? And some additional details about the stormy night and cars sliding off the road, whatever was happening. The resolution to my situation. And then, to me, a message or a lesson in this type of writing, I believe is the most important. I think everything's building towards what message am I sending to my reader in the end. So as you think about the stories you've written, do those things kind of fall into play in the personal history stories you write? Do you have those elements or some mix that's like that?
It appears to me that to give a message or a lesson, you pretty much have to have your audience in mind. And I haven't ever done that. On all my stories right now, I'm just telling it like I felt it, like it rolled out. And every now and then there's a moral, but most of the time it's just, this happened to me, I did this. You know, and it might be interesting. It was interesting to me, or I wouldn't have written it.
So, but why, that's the question. And that might be the message or the lesson is, why did you write it?
Why did you write it?
Well, why was that interesting to you? Right? Because I think about what the one you just told about the lightning in the back of this, in the station wagon. I just think of all the windows in the station wagon that we had when I grew up, and just looking, through this, the windows, and seeing the beauty all around me that I'd never witnessed before, to not be afraid of the nature, but to appreciate the beauty of that lightning storm. And that was the message I just got from what you shared, was that there's beauty to be had, and instead of fear.
I honestly, Rob, I think what you just described to me when you said you really don't think about the message or lesson, it depends on your audience. Honestly, it sounds like your audience you're writing to is you. You're sharing something meaningful.
That's one of the things I thought. I am writing for myself with the expectation that somebody else might get something out of it, but it's really for me.
So the message that I'm talking about is the one that you're getting, and you are sharing that in your writing. There is a message, and the message is what Paul was just asking. Why did you write it? What struck you about it? And by extension, then, that message is delivered to the person who hears or reads the story, because they start to think about why you wrote it. So I do think there's a message in what you're writing. I think you may be selling yourself short on the message side of this thing, because your message is originally focused on why did you find this moment to be memorable, and you're sharing it. And in sharing it, people are getting the message, or maybe their own message, from what you share, to the beauty of something that happened, or that they can witness in their own life.
Well, I think that what happens when you're writing a personal history is you set some kind of a tone or a place or feeling at the beginning, and then you develop through the different stories how you responded to that thing that you had. Okay, now, what did I have? I didn't realize we were poor. I didn't even think about that until when I started going to school. I realized I was the only kid in school that my mom made everything I wore. Anyway, and even then, that didn't bother me. And then I had things happen that were fun and that were instructive. I enjoyed, and I had a happy childhood. I had a happy time that I grew up. We had some climaxes, some issues, but by and large, I was happy. And I think that that's one of the things that I would want a message to be, but it isn't something that I would really go out and say. I was happy.
Well, but I'm just going to I'm going to take what you just said, and I'm going to put these 5 points on what you just said. The main character or protagonist is you. the situation didn't need, the situation being resolved was that you grew up poor and didn't know about it. The details that add color are all those things that happened around it that you were talking about that you really didn't just now get too specific, but you probably did in your story. The resolution was what? That you had a normal life. Everything, you went to school and you didn't notice. And the message is that that's okay. I mean, all of these elements are present in the story, in that short little excerpt you just told, as I hear it. Now, I'm going to tell you, I don't think about these things and map them out before I write a story, but I just find it interesting sometimes to go back and look at the story and pull them out of it and kind of think about what went into the story, because I think for most of us, they happen naturally when we tell the story.
I think that's true, except for there's one thing I would say instead of him having a normal life, I would say he had a happy life.
That's right. That's the message. Thanks.
Yeah. But, you know, that's something that I didn't get as I was doing it. I was happy, but I didn't say to myself, I have a happy life. But in retrospect, as I think about those things, that I write them down, everything has turned out okay.
And that's a message.
And that's the message. You know, and now as I live, we've been married 50 years, I realize that I married the right person.
That's good.
That's a great thing. But am I going to say that in the story? Maybe.
But the message of your story can still be delivered without using the words. I don't put this up there saying I'm going to say the words. Sometimes I do, but the message is there. The message is, as Paula was saying, you had a happy life. You have a happy life. You had these circumstances, these situations that most of us see. The resolution was you lived your life. Your mom made your own clothes, your clothes. These things happened. Those are the details. But in the end, the message is you had a happy life through whatever situation you were in, and that's a message. And it's a message to you, but it's also a message to me as I hear your story and think about, what am I whining about? Have a happy life. Just live a happy life. That's the message to your kids.
Well, yeah. Some of the messages then, of course, revolve around the church and how that happened in my life and what that meant to me because of the choices I made.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the thing, because some of the choices, in retrospect, may have been suboptimal. And yet, at the time I made those choices, I felt I had a good reason. Now, I don't want to say nothing happened accidentally. Lots of things happened accidentally, but in retrospect, perhaps they weren't an accident.
Some of us believe that most things aren't an accident. They are part of a plan.
Yeah.
So, all right, we're going to do this now with these stories. These are stories I wrote, and I'm going to just share. we're not going to read the whole story, but I'm going to share with you some elements of these stories, because I want to talk about my intro, my open for these stories. This is one about me.
Paula just tried to say something.
Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
I forgot.
That happens to me all the time.
This story is actually about us, because Paula was here. So I did this as a story development exercise, but I want to use it now for the intro. So this is my intro to this story. The winter of 2018 was a hard one for our family, but not so much because of bad weather as about loss. In January, my younger brother passed away while visiting his wife's family in Norway. And the following month, my mother-in-law, Paula's mom, joined him in returning to her heavenly home. Both came at a time when money was tight in the Johnson house, leaving Paula and me to work out the financial details of 2 unscheduled trips. And then I talk about after renting a car and driving to Arizona for my brother's funeral, we had to drive to Roseville, California for my mother-in-law's funeral in March, when the weather's supposed to be a little bit better, but in this case, it was a horrible snowstorm. So we were going on Interstate 80 through Northern California, through Donner, and that meant descending on this treacherous road. So that's how I opened the story. I kind of painted the picture of this time in my life there was death, there were tough things happening. And oh, by the way, we had to make this trip. And the rest of this story is about, well, I mean, my message that I ended up with, one of them is that one that's in the pullout quote right there. He wanted to teach me, he being God, that the purpose of prayer is to align my will with his, not to tell him how to answer my pleadings. And just to kind of summarize the story, I prayed and prayed and prayed, and we prayed, oh, let the roads be clear, let the weather be great. We want to just have a safe trip. We had to drive it on a weekend, and the roads were horrible. We were in a horrible snowstorm, but we got the right rental car that was a 4-wheel drive. We were able to drive down. Twice we had snow plows pull in front of us on the road, right in front of us in the dark while we were going through this blinding snowstorm. And we arrived safely. The message being, he was going to get us there, but he wasn't going to do it the way I wanted him to, which is give me a clean road and a fast trip. So I wrote this story about that. This is actually compiled in a book that I sent out to some people and some family members. But that's how I chose. I went for the dramatic intro, right? All this stuff was happening, and we had to make this trip. And then I went into the story. Now, I don't know if that's a good opening or not. You can tell me, you can judge me if you want. Maybe there's other ways I could have opened this story. Maybe you have thoughts about that.
It seems to me that the main player in your story isn't you.
Ah,
It's the Lord.
yes.
And it's how you recognize his answer to your prayer.
I would agree with that. Maybe I should have mentioned him more up front in my intro then, my open.
No, I think your opening is just fine because you're setting the circumstance. You're setting the need for doing it. And of course, your title of your thing sort of hints at what's coming.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe we need to have a session on titles.
We do. So I just break my story development down, and maybe my main character protagonist is wrong here. It could be the Lord, but it was Paula and I and Keisha and her husband, our daughter and her husband, in the car with the snowplows. Or God, the situation. Obviously, we need to get to California in a blinding snowstorm. The details that add color. I talked about skunks in Paula's father's house because we were going to stay with her dad. Then we couldn't because his house got skunked. But my sister contacted us out of the blue and offered us a hotel room that she was going to pay for. Because again, part of my setting the stage is we had some issues financially that it wasn't ideal for us to travel right then. So that's where the skunks come into play. And there were other things that came into play. The wind was horrible. The 4-wheel drive happened because the car rental place couldn't give me the standard car I wanted. So they said, we have to upgrade you for no extra cost. So there were all these details that add color and build towards, we're driving down this hill in the dark with snow flying in our faces and we can't see. And then the resolution was these snow plows that pull out in front of us, lighting the way and clearing the road that was completely snow covered, and there were no other cars. At that point, they'd all jumped on ahead of us, so they were way back, and lighting the way to our destination. And then here's your, God provides the way sometimes just in time. Twice those snowplows came out just when we got there. It was absolutely stunningly amazing. So this one had an obvious message, and it was easy to write. And I introduced it, mostly talk about the open. That's the way I opened it. You saw that, and some of these elements were there. This is a Hyde Taylor story about don't assume anything. I wanted to share this so you could kind of look at the way I opened this one and maybe get some ideas from that, or maybe tell me what I could have done differently. This story is called Don't Assume Anything, and this is from when Hyde was a commander of a unit in Vietnam. I interviewed Hyde, and I wrote the story, but it was from his storytelling from the interview.
Yeah.
The story begins with this. Missions in Vietnam are a bad time to make assumptions. Something Hyde learned during a series of events he describes as the most scared he has been at any time in his life. It began at a little outpost where a brigade had been completely overrun. I can't remember which battalion it was, but it was a platoon of GIs and they had some Vietnamese army supporting them. They had dug in a certain area and were supposed to defend. So I go right into the story, Hyde giving the details. After kind of teasing it with the missions in Vietnam, I actually used my message in my intro for this particular story in my open. Bad time to make assumptions. Basically, Hyde went into this thick grass thinking he had his whole platoon behind him, and it turned out he was alone. And there were 19 Vietnamese soldiers in there looking to kill him, and they all had guns. And he bluffed his way through it and got them all to surrender their guns, just using skills he learned in his military training. And that's the story, which is a great story. He bluffed his way out of it. But so I introed it by talking about that he assumed that his platoon was following him. He didn't check. And then he faced this situation, and then he bluffed his way out and had a happy ending because, you know, he's still there living down the street from us. But anyway, so that's the story. How would you open this story? How would you start it?
It was a dark, stormy night.
Well, actually, that's what you did. You set up a mission in Vietnam that gives you a place and a time, a circumstance that was beyond Hyde's control. He didn't start the war. He was caught up in it. And he didn't set the time. It was set by somebody else. But the circumstance and the way he worked himself out of it, that's the real story. But it's exactly like I said. He set the tone. You set the tone in the front by giving what and where.
Paul, what do you think about how would you start the story?
I'm trying to think of another way. I like how you started the story with, and I mean, in your title again, just like the other one, the title kind of leads into it as well. Yeah. That you kind of start with the main message. Don't assume, and it's a bad time to make assumptions. And so now we're riveted. What's the assumption that we're making, and how did that lead to a bad thing?
Yeah.
Although your first line could have been the last line in that block, I was surrounded by 19 guys with rifles. Of course, yeah. I'd want to say 19, not guys, but enemy soldiers, or right. The enemy was around me with 19 enemy, with rifles trained on me.
Yeah. Right. In the elephant grass. That's the part about the story is he was in the elephant grass. I just imagine. Elephant grass has got
to be really tall. That's an assumption.
Yeah.
So that's what you say. So you could have started that way.
Okay. I agree with that.
And and that if I was trying to get people on the edge of their seat, that might be what I would have done.
Yeah, a little more dramatic maybe than going with the conclusion part. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah, so, but the place where you are and the when, I think, especially if somebody reads a story out of the context of the rest of the book.
Yeah, which is kind of the way these books are designed. Is these are all individual stories that they can read one at a time, and they don't have to read. They all really don't relate. They don't tie to each other in this book. They tie by timelines that are in the book, but the stories themselves don't lead you to the next story. They're just lesson learned kind of stories from Hyde's military life. And so from that perspective,
story 10 doesn't depend on story 9.
Yeah.
Although what happens when you do that is you get a character, you start building a idea of the character of the person in that you're writing about.
Yeah. And that is still there in this book because you see Hyde's character through different situations that he was in, but they're all very different situations instead of kind of a carryover situation. Some of them do carry over, but most of them are unique situations that he was in where he's able to give different aspects of his person. I'm just imagining as I was interviewing him and writing this story, I was imagining Hyde Taylor, the Hyde Taylor that I know, down in the elephant grass with these 19 guys with guns trained on him, bluffing his way out of it and telling them to put their guns down. And they did. He used his commander voice, and these probably scared to death soldiers, probably thinking there was that 30 cal machine gun that he talks about trained on them, but maybe not. And they all reacted and turned over their guns. So I find, anyway, I'm going to not do this here, but so to me, the most important element of personal history is meaning. What life lesson did it teach? And I think even, Robin, in your case, where you're not focusing on it, but even your stories, or why did you tell the story, is in many cases the life lesson. It's the message. It's the reason you decided to write that, because of the meaning it had to me. And honestly, that's, I think, where the lesson comes from. And what
Well,
little
isn't that where all of them come from? Because when I start thinking about stories, it's what pops in my head. It's what I remember, not what somebody else remembered about me.
Right.
It's what I remember. And and like you said, your kids, and we do have this in our family, where I'll say, this is my story, and they'll say, no, I was there, it was this way.
I do that with my sister.
Yeah. And so, and then what I tell them is, it's my story, not yours.
Yeah.
If you want to write your story, feel free. I don't tell them that, really. That's what I should tell them.
So I know we're burning time, so I want to go. This is the original questions all over again, just to kind of put them up there. How do I open my story? That's not going to be good. How do I open my story? How do I draw my audience in? And I think there's all kinds of ways to do it. I can address my message. I can write the story first and come back and say, what's going to make this really fun for somebody to read? I can draw them in with something dramatic, like I did with some of those. I can draw them in just by starting into the story and sharing the information, like you were talking about, Robin. So there's all kinds of ways. I'm not sure. I guess the answer to the question I was asked about this is, there's not, I don't think, a right way. I think the right way is in the eye of the writer.
The question I have about that is, why am I writing this? Is it to make a bestseller? Is it to have somebody buy the sequel? Is it to have a movie made of it? Or is it just to explain, or just to illustrate my life to myself back, so I remember, or to my children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren, so they get a feel for what I did? I am not trying to be a Mormon. I mean, a Nephi, or somebody trying to write scripture. I'm not trying to do that. I'm really not trying to, at this point, I'm not trying to tell somebody, join the church. That should be plain by how it goes, but that's not my intent.
Yeah.
I think that's what makes it the best kind of story, though, for it to be organic like that. It might be an unintended consequence, or even a secondary consequence, but the fact that might happen, as a result, makes it is cool. The fact that you're not forcing it makes it even better.
Honestly, I think the advice I would give to someone who was asking me, how do I open my story, would be the same advice I would give, would be what should I write about, or how should I write it? Begin with the audience in mind. And the first audience is me. And the other audience is the people who are going to read the story. And if I just write realistically, an audience for a personal history is not a best-selling book. The audience of a personal history is people who can benefit from my story, or from Robin's story, or Paula's story. And if I begin with the audience in mind and I just tell the story, how I open it is probably not as important as did I share of myself within the story? And did I share well the experience I had and how it changed me or how it impacted me, or did I tell well the reason, not necessarily in words, but is it conveyed through my message the reason I wanted to share this particular story?
You know, you give me a thought. Several times, numerous times, I'll be sitting with my kids, a couple of kids, and we'll be talking. And one of them will say, I wish I had recorded this. And so the thought is, how did we start? How did we start the recollections and the stories when we were just talking with one or two other people? And have it be worthy of something where they kick themselves for not having recorded it. But you know, when we start, we don't know where we're going when we're just sitting and talking.
That's a great question.
So what was our start? Stellar? Or was it melodramatic? Or was it just, here's a memory?
Yeah.
And I think all are valid. Because what do we do when we're telling a story with when other people are around? We're probably telling them something that is like that furthers what they said. Oh, you had that happen. I had this happen.
Right.
And then somebody else says, oh, I had this. I don't know. When I'm sitting with my brothers and sisters and we're telling stories, it develops that way. And one says, well, I remember it this way. And they might correct an error I made. And that's fine.
I think that's actually a great tip for how do I open my story. To ask yourself the question, how did I open it when I was just telling it to somebody? When they asked about, when some topic was being discussed and I brought up this story, how did I open it then? There's nothing wrong with opening it the same way when you write it down.
Well, I think that's true. Well, thank you, Kurt. This has been
Thanks, I appreciate it. Hopefully this is meaningful for people who watch it and who are looking for an answer to that question or other questions about developing stories. I always appreciate your time, Robin. You always have great insights. You and Paul would like do a TV show or something, a podcast.
I'm really shocked every time I look in the mirror. And as I look at my face in the video here, I'm beginning to want to buy some of those round glasses so I can play Santa Claus. Anyway, thank you for having these. I enjoy them. And I hope that my comments are reasonable and make sense.
Your comments are the best thing about these, so I really appreciate them. And we'll think about titles, but if you think of something else you want to talk about next week, let me know. Send me a note. I'll be looking for topics again.
Okay.
All right. Enjoy your drive back tomorrow. Be safe.
Will do. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a good night.